We're looking at the third and fourth appearances of Jesus post-resurrection, the 40-day period of post-resurrection appearances based on Acts 1, verse 3, where Luke tells us that Jesus spent 40 days appearing, or he appeared to the disciples during 40 days, speaking about the kingdom of God. Sort of some final touches or finishing touches on the whole thing before he ascended back into heaven. Sunday afternoon we looked at the first two, Mary Magdalene and then the other women that were around the tomb or that had gone to the tomb. And now is the third and fourth. And really the third, there's not much to it. If we look at 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 5, when Paul is, 1 Corinthians 15 is a very long chapter by New Testament standards anyway, and it's all about the resurrection. And in the midst of that is when he says that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures. Thus verse 3. Verse 4 says that he was buried and that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles, and last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me. So the appearance that we're pointing out at this point is in verse 5, where it says he appeared to Cephas. And who is Cephas? Cephas is Peter. That's one of three different names he's called in the New Testament: Simon and Peter and Cephas. And the thing about this appearance is there's nothing else. That's it. At least that's the first mention. In Luke 24:34, there's a reference to the Lord appearing to Simon, who is also Peter. But by the time Luke mentions it, he mentions it as something that the disciples already knew about. So Paul, I guess depending on the chronology of when the books were written, Paul may have been the first to mention it, and then Luke records it as the disciples had already known about it. But other than that, we have no account of that appearance, just that it happened. And based on putting the text together, it is viewed as, I guess, the third of the appearances. It would have been nice to, for us at least, to know a little bit more about it. But if you think about that being the first time that Peter was able to, that was the first time Peter had seen Jesus since he denied him. So maybe there's a reason that the details weren't recorded, and maybe it would have been, maybe that is better that way. At least it may have been a very emotional, more than the others maybe. We do get to see one of the times that he saw Jesus later on at the end of John, near the end of John. But as far as this one, that's it. We just know that it happened, and we don't know anything else about it. Not the case with the fourth one. The fourth one may be the most detailed of the appearances, at least in length. And it is taken from Luke 24, verses 13 through 35. With a reference in Mark 16, 12 and 13. The very, very short version is in Mark 16. It says, "After these things he appeared in another form to two of them as they were walking into the country. And they went back and told the rest. They didn't believe him." So that's the short version. That's parallel to Luke 24, verses 13 through 35. And it's significantly more detailed. And we'll just read that first, and then we'll talk about it. It says, "That very day, two of them were going to a village named Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem, and they were talking with each other about all these things that had happened. While they were talking and discussing together, Jesus himself drew near and went with them. But their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And he said to them, "What is this conversation that you're holding with each other as you walk?" And they stood still, looking sad. Then one of them, named Cleopas, answered him, "Are you the only visitor to Jerusalem who doesn't know the things that have happened there in these days?" And he said to them, "What things?" And they said to him, "Concerning Jesus of Nazareth, a man who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and rulers delivered him up to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. Yes, and besides all this, it's now the third day since these things happened. Moreover, some women of our company amazed us. They were at the tomb early in the morning, and when they did not find his body, they came back, saying that they had even seen a vision of angels who said that he was alive. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they did not see. And he said to them, "O foolish ones, and slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken, was it not necessary that the Christ should suffer these things and enter into his glory? And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them in all the scriptures the things concerning himself." So they drew near to the village to which they were going. He acted as if he were going farther, but they urged him strongly, saying, "Stay with us, for it is toward evening, and the day is now far spent." So he went in to stay with them. When he was at table with them, he took the bread and blessed and broke it and gave it to them. And their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. They said to each other, "Did not our hearts burn within us while he talked to us on the road, while he opened to us the scriptures?" And they rose that same hour and returned to Jerusalem. And they found the 11 and those who were with them gathered together, saying, "The Lord has risen indeed, and has appeared to Simon." Then they told what had happened on the road, and how he was known to them in the breaking of the bread. Okay, so the timing of this, Luke tells us, straight away, that very day. Well, what very day? Well, based on verse 21, I guess based on verse 12, but also the reference in verse 21, it was the day of the resurrection. So the same day that we read in verse 1 of chapter 24. First day of the week at early dawn when they went to the tomb. So that very day, these two disciples were leaving Jerusalem. Now we're told the name of one of the disciples is Cleopas, but we're not told the name of the other one. And that pretty much leads to speculation who it was, maybe by some. I'm not sure if verse 34 has any role to play in that. Some have said that it is believed that it could have been Luke himself, the man who wrote this. It may have been him, and that would explain why it's recorded in such a. Sounds like it's recorded by somebody who was there, and knew what was going on. But whoever he was, we're not told. And if he's anything like John, if it was Luke, then that would be the reason why he was unnamed, because that's what John would have done too, just called him another disciple. But they were traveling to a village called Emmaus. It was about 7 miles from Jerusalem. We don't know where that was, other than 7 miles from Jerusalem. You can pick any direction, I guess, and take your pick. It's not certain where this village exactly was located, but we know it was 7 miles from Jerusalem. What we learned from the conversation is that these two men were disciples of Jesus, and obviously all the disciples, at least for some short time that day, got together and were discussing this stuff and trying to figure out anything really that they could possibly figure out. We already talked about how confused they were. They didn't know what to think, what to believe, what to make of any of this stuff. The more revelations are made, like the tomb was empty and we saw these angels, and the angel said that Jesus is alive, and about going to Galilee. They're trying to put together anything they can, and apparently by the time their conversation, their gathering ended, they didn't get anywhere. So now we see these two walking, and they're talking about all this stuff, and they don't seem to be in very high spirits. And we can understand, since Jesus had just been crucified a few days before, but also if they still didn't know exactly what in the world was going on and what they were to do now. What now? What are we supposed to do? And, is it really true that Jesus is alive and everything like that? But it says, while they were walking and talking, Jesus shows up. Jesus himself, it says he drew near and he walked with them. Now, he appeared to them in the same way he appeared to anybody else. There he is, he appeared. I can't think of a better word for it, because that's about as accurate as it can get. He appeared, but he joined them on their little walk, their journey from Jerusalem. We don't know how far down the road he joined them, but if it was pretty close to Jerusalem, they had a pretty nice little walk together. Even if it was halfway there, that's a pretty long way to have plenty of time to talk. And he asked them, "What are y'all talking about?" But verse 16 is important. Jesus drew near, went with them, but their eyes were kept from recognizing him. That's significant language, it seems to me. That's how the ESV reads. The old versions say their eyes were holden. Old word, obviously. New King James says restrained. Let's see. The Lexham English Bible says prevented. I don't have New American Standard on here. What's it say? Verse 16, Luke 24:16. Prevented. All these words. Well, I don't know about miraculous, but there are only so many different explanations. One would be that they were. What's that? Were being prevented. The language sounds like something that was being actively done by an outside force. However, it could be that they were blinded by their sorrow, maybe, something like that. Their eyes were kept from recognizing him because, like we talked about in the earlier lesson, that they weren't seeing, just like some of them weren't thinking clearly at the time. Maybe they weren't seeing clearly, or it may have been that God or the Lord himself actively prevented them from recognizing him for whatever purpose he may have had.
This commentary said that Mark 16:12 says that
He appeared in another form.
like maybe that.
Yeah, that's what Joe brought up Sunday afternoon. He may have looked different, and that would have definitely accomplished them not recognizing him. Obviously, if you think about, somebody could disguise themselves, except if you could literally look like somebody else, that's going to be a pretty good disguise instead of just, cutting your hair different or, doing something to make yourself look different. It may have been that Jesus appeared in a form that was different than the way Jesus looked for the express purpose of not being recognized by them, or maybe for the purpose of not being recognized by anybody for that moment. Surely they passed people on the road. But anyway, the point is, everything is open to speculation. But what Luke tells us is all that matters. They were unable to recognize Jesus for whatever reason at this point. This was just a man that showed up, that was walking like they were. It wasn't unusual. They weren't like, hey, mind your own business. Get out of here. You scared us, or, what do you want? But just walking down the road, fellow Jews, it seems, they would assume he was a Jew because, he had visited Jerusalem. He's leaving Jerusalem now. He was just like they were, as far as they were concerned. One thing they knew for certain was that it wasn't Jesus, because why would it be Jesus? And, even though they had heard the rumor that he was alive, So he asked them, what were y'all talking about just now? And it says they stood still looking sad. Almost like that stopped them right in their tracks. Like that question triggered, even though they were already talking about those things, it's like almost triggered something, and they were thinking about it and naturally looked sad. But the named disciple, Cleopas, he said he was shocked. He couldn't believe that a man who just left Jerusalem would not know, like it should just be obvious what they were talking about.
It's like if you're in New York after 9/11 and somebody's like, what do you accept that?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah, on September 14th, 2001, somebody's leaving New York City, and you're leaving New York City, and they say, hey, what are y'all talking about, or what's going on? And it's like everybody that was anywhere near New York City that at that time was talking about the same thing, because it was such a big deal. It's kind of like that. So he said, are you the only visitor to Jerusalem who doesn't know about what has happened this weekend, over this weekend? And he said, what things? What are you talking about? He said, Jesus of Nazareth, a man who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, how our chief priests and rulers delivered him up to be condemned to death and crucified him. But then in the middle of that, he also says, we had hoped that he was the one that was going to redeem Israel. That shows a sense, maybe not of utter hopelessness, but that they're sort of teeter-tottering. They don't know what to think. We had hoped. It doesn't necessarily mean that their hope is now utterly lost, that they've lost all of it, but that it's been severely damaged maybe. We had hoped.
Well, they obviously didn't believe Mary Magdalene when she came and told them.
Yeah, like we read that they didn't believe. It's almost like they didn't believe. They wanted to believe it. They didn't believe it, but they kind of, just a whole mix of emotions. They didn't believe, at least they didn't know enough yet to be certain about it.
if that happened here, we would probably be the same way.
Yeah, there's no doubt. For sure.
They had seen him raise other people from the dead, but they probably thought, okay, well, when he was alive, he raised people from the dead, but how can a dead man raise himself from the dead?
Yeah, he could raise people from the dead with ease, but now he's dead. So how does that work,
And they watched him be like, moved to a pulp and
Yeah,
died in like a super
and we have to remember,
gory.
if they understood the scriptures that was going to happen, they wouldn't have been in this strange limbo period. They would have understood that this, just like Jesus tried to tell them, this is not just what's going to happen, this is what is supposed to happen. And then something's going to come after that. I'm going to rise on the third day. But even as much as Jesus told them that, he didn't tell them anything beyond that. So now, as he says in verse 21, it is the third day. So even if Jesus is risen and they were absolutely certain about it, they didn't know what's going to happen now. How can we be a disciple to a Lord, a master who's not anywhere. We don't know where he is, or he's not here to tell us what to do or where to go or anything. So it may be that when he says we hope that he was the one to redeem Israel, that is still a reference to their way of thinking that he was going to save them from Rome. Because redeem Israel, that was certainly coming from a Jew of the first century. He wouldn't have in view what we would think of when we think about being redeemed by Jesus, but redeemed as in freed from the oppression of Rome and, turned back into the great kingdom of Israel of Solomon and David's day. So in that respect, their hope was not well-founded because he was not going to do that. But the reason he wasn't going to do that was not because he's dead now. It's because he was never going to do that. So they are very downtrodden and confused, and all they have to do now is to go back to presumably where they live, which was probably, I guess that's why they were going to Emmaus. And the rest of what he says confirms the idea that the disciples had gotten together. They weren't always together, or all together, but they did get together because they knew about what the women came and said. They were among those who were told about that, and then that Peter and John had gone to the tomb after that and seen exactly what they described, but they didn't see Jesus there. So they knew about all this stuff. But Jesus responds to him in a very Jesus-like way when earlier times when he talked to his disciples. "O foolish ones, slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Was it not necessary that the Christ should suffer these things and enter into his glory?" Now that, like we just said, that was their biggest problem, so they didn't understand that is what the Old Testament prophets said would happen with the Messiah. They've had the Old Testament. The Old Testament's, as old to them almost as the New Testament is as old to us. So they had the Scriptures all along, but they didn't understand that because they weren't taught properly. They thought they had this other idea about the Christ, and if they...
Well, they're still Jews now, right? They don't properly understand.
Well, they're disciples just like the apostles are.
They don't understand
But
that the Messiah described, like they don't understand that the Bible did.
they didn't understand that the Messiah, that was supposed to happen in the Messiah. That this was the way that, not only the way that God intended, because God could intend for something to happen and man be totally ignorant about it, but that was something that the prophets had actually said was going to happen. And they didn't understand that. So he tells them, was it not necessary that the Christ should suffer these things and enter into his glory? And not just necessary, but as he already said in verse 25, it's what the prophets said. The prophets said this all along. And so verse 27 is a very important verse because this is Luke talking again, the writer here, not Jesus, a quote of Jesus. But he just says, "And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them in all the Scriptures the things concerning himself." Now, he didn't tell it to them as though it was about himself, obviously, because they didn't know who he was. But Luke tells us that the things that Jesus was explaining to them was about himself. All the Scriptures, he interpreted to them the things concerning himself. In other words, all the Scriptures, not literally every single Scripture, but in all the Scriptures, there are things concerning Jesus. And yeah, he began right there in Isaiah 53. Luke doesn't say it, Isaiah 53, but he was reading Isaiah, and he said he began with that Scripture and preached to him Jesus. How in the world are you going to get Jesus out of a lesson on Isaiah 53? Because the whole thing of Isaiah 53 is about Jesus. And, by the way, that is one of the primary prophecies that mention the suffering of the Messiah. The thing that they could not wrap their heads around. He's going to be a king and in all glory, but he's going to be a servant who suffers? These things don't go together. Well, they did to the prophets because the prophets, especially Isaiah alone, mentioned both of those things about the Messiah, that he would be crowned in glory, but also crowned in another way, in suffering and even giving his life for everybody else. That's Isaiah 53. So yeah, Luke affirms both here and as he's retelling the account of Philip and the eunuch that the Scriptures are concerning Jesus. But Jesus at this point is explaining to them, he's giving them an Old Testament lesson about the Messiah, the Christ, and that obviously in the context of what he's just said, he's showing them and explaining them based on the Scriptures that the Old Testament prophets declared hundreds of years ago that the Christ was going to suffer these things, not just suffer in general, suffer these things that you have just talked about and enter into his glory. And so now they've come to Emmaus, and Luke says that Jesus, he acted as if he was going to go farther, and we can sort of picture that in our minds, like, all right, well, they're turning off and getting on, going into the village, but he's going to go on ahead. But they were like, hey, no, why don't you come stay with us or at one of our houses? Because I guess late afternoon at this point. So he goes. They sit at the table. They have a little bite to eat. Just like we see Jesus every time they're about to eat, he blesses it or gives thanks, and he gives it to them. And all of a sudden, it says their eyes were opened, and they recognized him. And as soon as they recognized him, he disappears. He vanished from their sight. And I can't think of a better word for that than disappeared. It doesn't say he left and they didn't see him again. It says he vanished from their sight right then. But the fact that the way that Luke says that their eyes were open, to me at least seems to suggest that their eyes had been closed, so to speak, by some outside force. Because what are the odds that both of them just happened to all of a sudden realize it was Jesus at the exact same time?
Can you imagine how crazy that would be? You're sitting at a table with somebody, like, having a conversation, but all of a sudden you see them as like a totally different, you recognize them, you're sitting with somebody that you're so close to, and all of a sudden you're like,
Yeah, they've been, again, they could have been walking with him for miles, a couple miles, at least probably a couple of miles.
well,
Yeah.
that's good. Yeah,
If they weren't shocked enough to realize it was Jesus, the dead man, the man who they thought was dead that's not dead now, we know he's not dead because we've just been talking with him and walking with him, and then he just disappears. Yeah. I would love to have seen the conversation between those two after Jesus. It's like, have I lost it, or did somebody put some mushrooms in this bread or something, or did you just see the same thing I saw? Wayne, did you have something?
Well, they evidently have to be hard-headed, because if the author is correct, that there are over 300 prophecies in the Old Testament, and Jesus dealt with those, you've got to be thick-headed if you don't get it.
Yeah. Well, whenever somebody's been taught, regarding all these prophecies, and people still do the same thing. There's all these passages, but then we cherry pick or take certain passages and be like, no, that's not about that. This is about something else. And that's what they had to do with Isaiah 53, that's not about the Messiah. That is about Israel or something like that. Because if they understood that was about the Messiah, then they would have to understand that Isaiah so clearly said that the Messiah was going to suffer and be his life be taken, he'd be killed, in the stead of others or for others, but none of them understood that. So obviously they filed Isaiah 53 in a different category than Messianic, which they were wrong in doing that. But
And they did that because that's what the rabbis taught themselves.
yeah, that's what they were, the higher ups. And that is a very good example of why every single person should be an independent student of the Bible.
But also a good figure of what you learn from childhood is so ingrained, like it's
Yeah.
so hard to reverse what you've been taught by your parents and, from childhood, like what you've learned.
Yeah, isn't it ironic that just like in this case, their eyes were literally closed from recognizing Jesus, their eyes were figuratively closed from seeing Jesus in the Scriptures, seeing the Messiah in the Scriptures, until they were suddenly, He opened their eyes in terms of the Scriptures, and now their eyes were open literally, and they recognized Jesus, and then He vanishes from their sight. But then they said to each other, they sort of said, and it just seems so typically human, I guess, that it's almost like they're saying, we kind of knew it was Him all along. Yeah, it's like, didn't you knew, we knew. How did we not really see it? Because we could tell something was going on. Our hearts burned within us while He talked to us on the road. They're sort of entertaining that I could tell something was up. Of course, hindsight's 20/20, as they say, and then it's like, we knew it was Him,
Well, I mean, how many people, I don't know how common Jesus' type of speech was. I would assume not very, because everybody was always amazed at how He taught.
Yeah.
Authority. And in verse 25 and 26, I mean, if their eyes were not prevented by some outside source from seeing Him, you would have thought, if it was just the grief or something like that, you would have thought that verses 25 and 26 would have opened her up.
Yeah, depending on how much time they had spent with Jesus in person. They were clearly disciples, but we don't know at what point, they became disciples and how much teaching they had learned. But, based on Mark's account about that different form, it could be his voice sounded different. I mean, everything was different. So one question that they would have had to have been asking themselves, in their own minds at least, this whole time is, who is this man? Yeah, he is really, he's a really good teacher. He's really, yeah. Yeah, I guess because he was at home in his room studying the Scriptures, and that's why he didn't know what was going on in Jerusalem. His head was in his books, which, as far as that goes, paid off for him. But that they had to have been wondering. They were amazed at this. They had to have been amazed by him, and that they didn't know who he was. And now they know who he is, realize who he was. And now they're going to turn right back around and race back to Jerusalem, because now they have to tell the people they just left. Now there's another account that they need to hear. So Mary Magdalene came and did it, the women. Then he appeared to Peter in some capacity. Now he's done it again. So it says they rose that same hour. They asked Jesus to stay, or they asked the man to stay, because it was toward evening. Now, even though it was toward evening, they're going back to Jerusalem to tell the others that they have seen Jesus, to confirm that he has in fact risen. It says they found the 11 and those who were with them gathered together, saying, "The Lord has risen indeed." Now, the question is, at this point, the reference to appearing to Simon, and whether that is a reference to this, which would certainly make sense, or whether that is something disconnected from that. But it may just have to be filed in the unclear category. Maybe Simon is the other disciple for all we know. But at any rate, they said that Luke seems to be saying that they said this to the 11, and Peter is one of the 11. And so that part's unclear. But it says, then they told what had happened on the road. Now maybe that shows that what they said about appearing to Simon was different than what just happened with them. But at any rate, they went and told. Now the interesting thing is, based on Mark's account, it once again says they didn't believe him. If you remember when we just read that at the beginning, after these things, he appeared in another form to two of them as they were walking into the country. They went back and told the rest, but they didn't believe him. So, of all three accounts of appearances so far, it was met with disbelief or unbelief, if we want to call it that, which again just shows how confused and devastated they were. And I guess how human they were, because how many times have they been visited by dead people, or that people that they know were dead at least? Not very often. I would dare to say never. They never had. So,
Possibly on the day of crucifixion.
what's that?
Possibly on the day of crucifixion. When the saints.
Oh, with yeah, that's true. It seems that was different, though, than this, him appearing like this. The people that had been raised from the dead in the past, any other time, they were just alive again, and it was not so much appearing, it was just that they're here. Like Lazarus, he was dead, and he's alive again, and here he is. We can go see him if you want. We can go over to Bethany and see Lazarus. He lives in Bethany. Or, the son at Nain, he's just alive again. Those people were alive again. We don't know how long they stayed alive or how that worked. But Jesus was different, because he seems to be, he's here, he's there, he's over here, he's here. These people see him. He's there, but then he's not. Just like in this case. He's there, they suddenly realize who he is, and now he's gone. Where'd he go? We don't know. But he's gone. But one thing we know for sure is that he was here. That tomb's empty. We don't know where Jesus went, but Jesus seems, all these different independent from each other sources are reporting that Jesus visited them. So every time it's like a piece of the puzzle is added to the list. It's not helping them so far, because they're like, okay, Mary said that she saw him. She thought he was the gardener, but he wasn't. Okay. The women said they saw him. They talked to him. These guys say they saw him. They didn't know who he was. Then they knew who he was, and he disappeared. What do we do with all this? What do we? Well, maybe maybe the tomb is empty, and they don't know where the body is, because the body is not anywhere to be found. And maybe, with every time it's going to be a little bit more. And Peter, if the placement of that one is where it belongs, is where we've put it, Peter at least would know. And it may be at this point that even Peter was still not sure, even though he himself seems to have been witness to one of these appearances. So they did not know what to believe. And so that's why every time they're told about an appearance, they didn't believe it, because they couldn't make sense of it. And many times when we can't make sense of something, we just choose not to believe it. And that could be a powerful lesson for a lot of people today. I don't understand everything about God. There are questions we don't know. Where'd God come from? And how can anything not have a beginning? I'll never be able to understand that. Nobody will. Nobody, ever. I don't even know if we'll understand that in heaven. Because how could we understand that? But I believe it. Because I have reason to believe it. A lot of people, just like we talked about Sunday, they don't want to believe certain things, so they come up with other supposedly natural explanations that require just as much faith as anything else. Eventually, something has to be taken on faith. Like, even if all this naturalistic stuff is true, where did the first thing come from? It had to come from something. But where'd that something come from? You see, that none of it makes sense.
Because even people who turn away from God or quote religion, they basically always just end up in another religion. Even if they don't call it a religion, like it is.
Yeah, it's a religion.
Another belief system that's almost cult-like in a way that they end up in.
Yeah, it's almost like humans cannot avoid being a proponent or a worshiper of something. It's almost ingrained into human nature. We will worship something. It may be God. It may be the true God. It may be some other God. It may be celebrities. It may be political leaders. It may be the universe. It may be myself. But I'm going to worship something because that's just the way. Yeah, that's the way that we are. We were made that way. And to turn away from God because there are some things that I just can't make sense of is not just foolish, it's not consistent, because there are things, like I said Sunday, that those people would believe that they have no reason to believe those things at all, like aliens. There's never been a single speck of evidence ever in the history of mankind for the existence of extraterrestrial life forms. But you know how many people believe that they exist? A lot. And you'd be shocked that I bet there are people you know that believe they exist. They don't have a reason to believe it, but they believe it because they want to believe it. And they also believe that the American government's hiding the spaceships and stuff down in Arizona or New Mexico, wherever it is, at Area 51. Hey, they might be. I bet they're hiding something down there. I bet the American government and every other government is hiding a whole lot of stuff. But it ain't alien spacecrafts, I can guarantee you that. But there are people that believe that they're out there.
That's why they call them UFOs. That's why the government calls them UFOs.
Yeah.
Unidentified flying object. They're not saying it's an alien ship.
Yeah, UFO.
Unidentified.
Yeah, anything that is flying around that you don't know what it is technically a UFO. But the thing is, every single time that people have seen these things, it's found out to be a hoax. And yet, people still believe it, just like with evolution. The missing link, that thing that they are looking for that will be dug up that has some sort of proof of, what came between, the age of when the ape or whatever was the highest evolved creature, and man, there's a whole lot that happened between there. They've never found any evidence of it, but it's out there. And over the years, there have been people that have come up, and here it is. We found this skull that looks kind of human, but doesn't look exactly human. It is obviously one of these missing links that ties it all together. And then they find out that somebody made that thing by, they had the skull of an ape, and they shaved off, some things here and there. And that's happened multiple times. And guess what? People still believe that thing is out there, or that missing link is out there to find. Instead of concluding, these people keep making this stuff up to try to corroborate their story, maybe we shouldn't believe anything they say.
Well, that's
And-
just it. I mean, they change, that story changes over and over and over and over, and people still continue to believe it, but God's word has never changed.
Yep.
And for some reason, that's the one that's hard to believe.
Yeah.
It's never changed is the one that they don't believe.
Because people don't want to believe it and they don't want you to believe it. So they can't make it not true, but they can make it as if it's not true if they can convince enough people that it's not true. So I can't make God stop existing, but I can make myself not think about him if I make everybody around me not believe that he exists. So if they don't believe he exists, then I can live as if he doesn't exist and not have to worry about it.